Well, hello, everyone. Thank you to all our attendees and our presenters who are here with us this evening. I think we will take the time to get started now, just so that we give ample time for all our presentations and questions. And hopefully some people can kind of trickle in as I make our introductions. So thank you again for taking the time to join us sort of across all these different time zones. On behalf of our group, the Crustacean Task Force, as well as our partners within the Environmental Defense Fund and Lenfest Ocean Program, we hope you find our webinar both informative and interesting. So this webinar is one of a series which is developed as part of this Crustacean Task Force partnership. The purpose of these webinars being to explore topics relevant to crustacean fisheries across top crustacean fishery producing nations, sort of presenting a mixture of both research, expertise, and input. And in this webinar, we are going to discuss marine protected areas, sort of their scale internationally, covering the current status of international MPA implementation, the various successes and failures of MPAs to meet their fisheries and conservation goals, and to specify some of the unique crustacean biological and fishery dynamics that drive NPA outcomes for some of these crustacean species. So all of these topics and a little bit more will be described by our three expert presenters, Dr. Ray Hilborn, Dr. Hunter Langhan, and Dr. Yunzhou Li. So please feel free to type questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom window. As they occur to you, we will have a brief Q&A period at the end of each presentation. So we are slightly restricted by time, but we will endeavor to address as many of your questions as possible. And our presenters each have quite the rich background in MPA and fisheries research. So I will introduce them sort of in order of presentation. And to start us off, we will hear a presentation from Dr. Yunzhou Li. Yunzhou, if you would like to share your screen at your leisure. Dr. Yunzhou Li is an alumnus of the University of Washington, University of Maine, and Ocean University of China, and is currently a postdoc researcher at the Stony Brook University School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. She is an expert of fisheries modeling and management with applications to MPA policy and spatial fisheries management. And Yunzhou's research explores sort of this dynamic between coupled human and ecological systems, specifically from a fisheries and conservation lens. I suppose I forgot to introduce myself as the moderator. I'm Nathan Wilsey. I am a graduate student at Stony Brook University as well. So Yunzhou is one of my esteemed colleagues in that regard. And with that, Yunzhou, whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nathan. Well, I hope everyone is doing well today. My name is Yunzhou Li. I'm a postdoc at Stony Brook University. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And as the first speaker of today's webinar, I'm going to give you a talk about overview of MPAs in the globe and also in the 4 crustacean task force countries. So I want to start from very basic question, why MPA is so important. Well, the benefits of MPAs have been documented through a variety of case studies and meta-analysis. Basically, MPAs can foster greater biodiversity through restricting human activities in a certain space. And this is also helpful to ecosystem productivity and resilience to stress events, such as climate change. And also, MPAs can provide benchmarks of ocean health, which basically describe the status of marine ecosystems in an ideal undisturbed situation. And for fish and fisheries, MPAs protect specific life stages and critical habitats. And there's also increasing evidence showing that there are bigger and more fish inside the reserves, and MPA has the potential to export fish like juvenile and adult fish to open waters so that it can benefit commercial fisheries. And in addition to those ecological benefits, there are also tremendous benefits for human society. For example, there are a lot of MPAs in the world that are protecting cultural and historical sites, and MPAs can increase recreational and tourism opportunities, which can eventually diversify the livelihoods of local communities. And then MPAs are also a great place for people to experience and study marine life and marine ecosystems that are largely intact. Well, even though there are so many MPA benefits from MPA, it's really important to understand that MPA is not a panacea to all environmental issues. For example, there are a couple of threats that cannot be addressed by MPA, like plastics, invasive species, and marine pollution. And even though an MPA has been proposed or designated, it still cannot guarantee the conservation benefits if there is no proper design, good compliance of stakeholders, strong enforcement capacity, sustainable financial solutions, consistent and long-term monitoring evaluation, and adaptive management, which is really crucial in a changing climate. And lastly, if we want to accrue the benefits for fisheries and conservation, it's also important to have strong fisheries management beyond the MPA boundaries. So how are we doing at a global scale? The international committee has set a target to protect 10% of oceans by the end of 2020. But at the current stage, if we count MPAs only, we are reaching less than 8% of the ocean protected by MPAs. So there's definitely some conservation gaps between what we have and the 10% goal. And if we take a further look at those existing MPAs, it's also important to understand, not all MPAs are providing the same level of protection. For example, the recently published MPA guide has defined a spectrum of marine protection, ranging from full protection to minimal protection. And as you can see on this figure, the benefits from different types of MPA also vary greatly. With the full protection, MPA usually prohibit all types of resource extractions like commercial fishing, seabed mining, oil and gas drilling, and therefore they can generate more conservation benefits than those are minimally protected. However, we only have less than 3% of world's oceans in this type of MPA. And as Nathan just mentioned, we have 4 countries engaging on our Crustacean Task Force project, which are the US, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And I want to mention they're not only countries with top crustacean production, but also they have long-standing tradition in coastal and marine conservation. And in terms of MPAs, they are also at very different stages in terms of, MPA designation, management effectiveness. So next, I will give you a brief overview of the implementation of MPAs in these countries and also their contribution to the crustacean-related goals. All right, so for US, as of 2020, 26% of US waters are in some type of MPA and 3% are in no-take MPA. And many MPAs in the US are protecting habitats like mangroves, seagrass, tropical, and deep sea corals. But there are also a bunch of MPAs that are targeting, the crustacean and their spawning grounds as one of their objectives. For example, in Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, it has been observed that the legal size Spiny lobster is significantly larger in the MPA than the exploited areas. And there's also a good story from California MPA network. They have some benefits for the fisheries of Spiny lobster. And we have another speaker, Dr. Hunter Langhan, will be introducing and sharing about their experience. And in terms of challenges, well, one of the concerns is centered around the representation of habitat by diversity in the no-take MPA in the US. So if you look at this map, so you can find the distribution of no-take MPA, which is a red spot, is highly uneven, with half of them are in the remote Pacific Islands. And then there's also a challenge about climate change, which has the potential to redistribute species and cause habitat loss. And it has been argued that most MPAs in the United States are not prepared for climate change. And finally, MPAs in the United States are developed through a variety of programs, like federal, state programs, and they also have different conservation goals and management approaches. So there is the question of ecological connectivity between different MPAs. And for the next step, the Biden administration has made a commitment to conserve at least 30% of US lands and waters by 2030. But I want to mention the executive order has not defined the level of protection that will be used to track the progress towards the 30 by 30 target. And next, we have China, which is the largest fishery production country in the world, but its conservation efforts, especially in the ocean, is much less known. So if you search China's MPA on the World Database of Protected Areas, you will find there are only 15 MPAs from China are recorded. But actually, according to the National MPA database, there are more than 270 MPAs, covering about 5% of China's rainwaters. And plus, China has established more than 50 aquatic germplasm reserves, which are considered as fishery conservation areas, and they're protecting critical habitats like spawning grounds, foraging areas for fishery sources. And here is an adaptive figure from a recent study by Bohoclis, and you can see those typical ecosystems and habitats that are being protected by MPAs in China, mostly coastal MPAs. But there are also some reserves that are specifically targeting crustaceans, like Chinese spiny lobster, Chinese prawn. But the problem is that there is very limited data available to support the evaluation of these MPAs to understand how they're working in terms of protecting the crustaceans. And then, there are a lot of challenges in China's MPA. The biggest challenge is the effectiveness of MPAs. So it starts from the planning. MPAs in China are designated through a bottom approach, but there is rather limited systematic planning at a national scale. So that leaves us some conservation gaps in the national waters in some ecoregions, especially in the offshore waters. And many MPAs in China still don't have their own monitoring programs, which makes it really difficult to have evaluation to understand the biological, ecological, and socioeconomic impact. And finally, funding, personnel, and management capacity are insufficient to support the management and enforcement of the MPAs. So to address these challenges, China has initiated an MPA reform to develop a more effective MPA system with national parks as the main body. And they also set a very specific timeline, including by 2025, streamlining the regulatory framework, and also to improve the effectiveness of MPA through filling the conservation gaps and also improving the monitoring system by 2035. And next we have Philippines, which has the largest number of MPAs of all these 4 countries. But different from US and China, most MPAs in the Philippines are managed by local governments and communities. And if you look at this map, you will find MPAs in the Philippines is, dotted close to shore, and they are generally small in size. The most common objectives in the Philippines are to protect mangroves, seagrass, coral reef, and also to sustain fisheries. But there is no MPA currently for crustaceans. And even though Philippines has a large number of MPAs, the benefits of MPA are showing mixed results. For example, there are some really well-managed MPA like Eco Reserve, which is one of the oldest MPA in the Philippines. There have been some positive effects showing on the density of fish inside and outside MPAs. But the majority of MPAs in the Philippines are considered as paper parks because they lack clear management objectives and also have very limited funding to support monitoring, enforcement, and research. And this further leads to a serious problem of illegal fishing inside the reserve and overfishing on the boundaries of MPA. And finally, climate change has been increasingly recognized as emerging challenge for MPAs in the Coral Triangle region. So it has been proposed to develop a more resilient MPA network through scaling up locally managed MPAs in the region And the government has also made a commitment to protect 15% of coastal municipal waters through a variety of types of MPA. Last but not least, we have Indonesia, which has established almost 200 MPAs as of 2019. And these are also the major types of habitats that are being protected by Indonesia MPA. And there is also a new conservation area recently developed for shrimp. And similar to China and the Philippines, the biggest challenge in Indonesia is the effectiveness. So they have been facing threats from destructive fishing, coral and sand mining, and mangrove exploration. And there are also some complex jurisdictional issues between MPAs and the fisheries management areas, which further hindering the effective implementation of MPAs. And moving forward, the Indonesian government has made commitments to protect 10% of the national waters by 2030. And they also aim to improve the effectiveness of MPAs by 2030 through a series of programs. For example, improving MP planning, diversifying financial solutions, and reducing the gaps in implementation. Well, this is my last slide. I just want to quickly summarize that there are some commonalities between these four countries, especially in the Asian countries in terms of objectives, challenges, and interest to improve their MP effectiveness. So I think that really provides some good opportunities for us to address these challenges and also to explore how we can maximize the benefits from marine conservation for fisheries. And finally, I want to thank our regional task force members for their input. And thank you all for listening. I'll take any question if there's anyone.
Thank you, Yunjo. That was terrific. I did see one question just popped up in our chat here, and we do have a few minutes for questions. Anonymous attendee thanks you for your informative presentation and wonders, why are the Great Lakes protected areas considered as MPAs in the US?
Well, actually, I think basically the protected area system in the United States are considering both the marine areas and the Great Lake region. So that's why they also count the protected areas in the Great Lakes as one of their conservation area. Maybe Ray and Hunter have some others to add.
They're very big lakes, so it's good to have them within management schemes.
I have one final question for you, Yunjo, since there are none from the audience. You were mentioning we have some of these MPAs are sort of designed to protect either cultural sites or recreational opportunities or even mangroves. And I expect there's probably some sort of implied benefit to crustacean or other fishery species within them. But is there any mechanism or any specific MPAs that sort of work to double dip and maximize the output for harvesting of the non-protected species with limited low impact fisheries that won't, affect either the cultural benefit or the mangroves?
Well, I think there's a very interesting case in Indonesia, which is about after they established the MPAs in the local area, but I don't think this is for crustacean. But I think there is like a trend that many local fishermen, they have been shifting their livelihoods to other activities like tourism or aquaculture, because they see that these activities are more profitable, and therefore these activities have been lowering the fishing effort to all the species in this area, and that can also provide some protection to not only the target species but also the non-target species in the surrounding areas. I'm not sure if that addressed your question.
Certainly, I think it's sort of adapting fisheries uses to other opportunities in the face of MPAs. I guess if there's no more questions specifically for you, we will move on to Dr. Ray Hilborn. Ray, if you'd like to share your slides. Dr. Hilborn is a professor within the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington, and he has a rich background in fisheries management. Ray leads an influential research lab that specializes in stock assessment as well as fisheries performance across ecological and management metrics. Ray is also on the editorial board for several renowned fishery science journals and fisheries management councils, and has received numerous awards for his long service throughout his storied career to the fisheries science community, including a Volvo Environmental Prize and International Fisheries Science Prize. And with that, Ray, whenever you are ready, we would love to hear you speak.
Okay, thank you. I assume that you can hear me and see my screen now.
Yes, you look and sound good.
All right. Well, okay. First, I want to start off by saying I'm going to take the skeptic's attitude here, and many of you may know Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And one of the things that I learned very well, that I try to follow since early in my career, is the importance of being skeptical. And he said, skepticism is the highest of duties, blind faith, the one unpardonable sin. So I'm going to just apply a little of the skeptic's lens to MPAs. And this time of year, the bane of my existence is leaf blowers. There was just my neighbor's gardener was out there blowing leaves all over. And I like to sort of make the analogy of MPAs being like leaf blowers. That is, in general, the fisheries issues are that we have too many fishing boats. If we're overfishing, and they're like leaves, they're everywhere. And so you decide to protect some areas by moving the problem away. And I think this is the fundamental problem in understanding MPAs, is they don't reduce fishing effort. They simply move it, and you fish the protected area, in theory, zero, but you fish the other areas more. But you haven't reduced the fishing effort. You have the same number of boats, same with their fishing pressure, their bycatch, et cetera. You haven't really, if the problem is too much fishing effort, you need to reduce the fishing effort. And so this guy here is raking up his leaves and hopefully going to burn them or bag them up or something. So just a little bit of basic theory and that about MPAs, that essentially, and particularly with respect to their more yield, you're not going to increase the yield by closing areas unless you're seriously overfishing. What's going to happen if you're not seriously overfishing is abundance will go up inside the closed area, but will go down outside. So the potential benefits to both yield and just total abundance of fish of MPAs are when overfishing is happening. And as it happens, I worked as a collaborator with the Spanish, well, a number of people, but it was led by the Spanish scientist on an MPA in the Mediterranean around this little spot here. And this was unlike most places in the Mediterranean. They were able to enforce the MPA pretty effectively because there was a Coast Guard station with a radar on this island, and that little quadrangle you see there, there was the closed area. They were able to enforce it. Those circles are where all the fishing effort took place, typically fishing the line. And what we found is that the size of individuals increased dramatically as the marine protected area had been in place for longer and longer. This is for, sorry, I forgot to mention, this is for a lobster, because they were basically hammering this thing with tangle nets all along the bottom outside the reserve, grossly overfishing. And this reserve gave a pretty significant benefit in terms of producing bigger lobsters that had a chance to get up to a decent size before they were silly enough to drift out of or walk out of the reserve and get caught. But if you look at other empirical evidence, this is sort of, I'd say, the summary slide from this paper by Sarah Lester that shows that if you that the estimates of what happened inside reserves, where the biomass went up, say on median value of 400%, density went up 166%, average size 28%, and species richness by 21%. And this is sort of the main theme of how MPAs increase biodiversity and potentially provide fisheries benefits. I think I'll skip by these. That you see, there's been over time, there are some changes, but this is almost always done by comparing what happened inside the reserve to what happened outside the reserve. And you have to remember that outside the reserve is where the fishing pressure that was inside the reserve used to be. So using areas outside the reserve are not an effective control or a realistic control on what would have happened. And even if you have a sort of a real Baki design with before and after, the problem is, what if there was a regional environmental change that affected everything? Then the abundance may have gone up inside the reserve and gone up outside the reserve simply because there was an environmental change. So in fact, it's very difficult to imagine a statistical design that is really going to let you answer the question, are there more fish? Are there bigger fish because of the reserve? And you certainly can't just look inside the reserve, because you have to look what the impact of the fishing effort was outside the reserve. Just use an example from the California South Coast and Channel Island MPAs. This is actually just showing you there's about roughly 20% of this area was put in reserves. And this is a figure from this paper by Hamilton, showing that what happened is that targeted species, that's in red, went up inside the reserve and went down outside the reserve. Exactly what most of your MPA modeling would have predicted. And if you do the math, if the abundance doubled inside the reserve, but decreased by 1/3 outside the reserve, and 80% of the areas outside the reserve, then what's the net benefit? There's no regional benefit. You simply have some areas that are nice, pristine places, but overall you don't have more fish. You don't have more fish to catch. This is from a paper by Dan Ovando, which was part of a PhD thesis at UC Santa Barbara, where he tried to use the changes in abundance of non-target species as the control. So presumably subject to the same environmental conditions, there's issues. But basically what he found is it looked like there was a net benefit for the first years after the reserves, but out there 10 to 12 years after the reserve, there really seemed to be no net increase in the abundance of the target species across the region. Of course, there were more inside the reserve. So let's just talk briefly. So what's different about crustaceans? And one is that many can have very size selective fisheries, because you can catch them and release them live, particularly in traps and things like that. Now, it depends on the gear, but that offers a lot of potential for management in ways that are not available to more generic finfish fisheries. Adults may be less mobile than many fish, but that depends a lot on the species. And another difference is they may need to move through habitats at different life history stages to find the appropriate combination of protection from predators and access to food. And John Caddy has a very interesting book on that, where he basically argues that what crustaceans, or many crustaceans anyway, need is certain size cracks in the substrate that gives them the protection from predators, and that's one of the reasons you often see these large migrations, is they've got to move from habitat with one size cracks, and then as they get bigger, they got to go to a new place. So if I want to think about some other area-based measures, not just no-take areas, there'd certainly be the potential to apply differential size limits in different areas. Say, well, we'd like to have some places, for various reasons, that you have some really big individuals. And that's certainly a possibility. But if having some large individuals in some areas is desirable, you know, why not over the whole area? I just want to close with a graph that came out in National Geographic. I think it came largely out of work from people, again, at UC Santa Barbara, that summarizes the threats to marine ecosystems by habitats. So the rows are habitats ranging from rocky intertidal beach, mudflats, salt marshes, mangroves, then down to surface waters, soft shelf, hard shelf, soft slope, hard slope, soft benthic, hard benthic, deep water, and seamounts. And across the top are the stressors. And the first ones are largely climate change, temperature, ocean acidification, sea level rise. Then you get into shipping, nutrient pollution, organic chemical pollution. Then you get into various kinds of fishing on the right. And what you see is that the greatest threats are almost all associated with climate change issues, with temperature rise, ocean acidification, and sea level rise. And that at least by their classification, fishing is a relatively minor threat. And so that's one of my, I'd say one of the things that I have to say irks me is that the proponents of MPAs talk about protecting the ocean and talk about highly protected areas, but all they're highly protected from is from fishing. They're not highly protected from these threats that are considered the big threats. And so, you know, as a skeptic, I'm saying, look, you're barking up the wrong tree. You're not protecting the ocean by closing 30% of the ocean, as in this 30. All you're doing is moving fishing boats around. And I think there's a growing realization within the MPA community that particularly because distributions are shifting, that the old terrestrial national parks model of locking up some areas isn't going to work, because if you lock up areas now, 20 years from now, whatever you were protecting there has moved. And I would use the North Atlantic right whale, which I'm sure you people in Stony Brook are very familiar with, as an example, that if you had identified North Atlantic right whale habitats 20 years ago and set up MPAs around that, they'd be in all the wrong places. They wouldn't be in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They wouldn't be in all the places that North Atlantic right whales are now being found. So I think there's a coming together. A lot of the people in the MPA advocacy movement are starting to think about what we actually need is a more dynamic form of ocean management. That is, we need to monitor where things are and potentially shift closed areas where closed areas are the right tool as the distribution of things changes. So let me just conclude by saying let's devote most of our energies to addressing the big problem, which is climate change. And again, you know, there's a lot of arguments that MPAs are more resilient to climate change, but doesn't that mean that outside of the MPAs are less resilient because you've moved the effort out there? Primary fisheries management approaches should be to control fishing effort or catch and size limits to achieve the desired benefits. If it is not possible to control fishing pressure, MPAs, if enforceable, may be a win-win situation. And I think that's probably true for a fair amount of the world, certainly the Mediterranean. And finally, that climate change is shifting distribution, so protecting where the species are now is not likely to be where they'll be in the future. And the traditional permanent closed area model is definitely the wrong approach. So thank you very much.
Excellent, Ray. Thank you. I think your dogged skepticism is certainly appreciated, and your leaf analogy is probably especially effective given the autumnal timing of our webinar.
Yes.
I guess while we wait for maybe some audience questions to roll in, I could mention that my graduate student research actually is directly with lobsters and right whales, so that was a well appreciated aside. And to dig a little bit more into it, since MPAs are, as we can see, neither a magnificent cure-all nor a failed idea, but somewhere in the between with lots of potential benefits, is there a case where we can adapt MPA implementation to capitalize on these purported benefits for crustacean fisheries? As sort of an example, like if you could have a seasonally shifting MPA to capitalize on the increased size of individuals you saw to increase landings value, or have specific gear access MPAs, like what we're seeing with closed areas for right whales and only allowing ropeless gear. In your experience, do you think those would maybe alleviate some of the benefits of just redistributed fishing effort?
Well, again, you have to identify the problem. So, in the case of right whales, the problem isn't too many boats, it's too many pots. And too many buoys. And so it's not a catch problem, it's an interaction with gear problem. And so, yeah, I mean, again, MPA is a bad term because it can mean so many different things. Let's say strict no-take areas. There are certainly benefits for that in certain times and certain places. But I would say first, and this is, I'd say, a problem I have with many of the proponents for MPAs is they don't say, what is the objective? And they say, we want to protect, but how would you measure it? And so what is the specific problem you're trying to address? Is it overfishing? Or is it preservation of a cultural site, or generating a major tourist site? Those are all legitimate, but identify the problem and then look at the range of tools, of which no-take areas is one of them.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a few of the questions from the chat here. Cody Zwalski asks, are there any countries in the world that you think are in a position in terms of monitoring or enforcement to implement the sort of adaptive MPAs that you were describing? And if not, what do you see as the key hurdles to achieving that? And maybe Yunjo as well might have something particular to answer this, but Ray, if you'd like to start.
Well, I mean, if you say an adaptive MPA is an adaptive closed area, that's already common practice in Alaska and the west coast of the U.S., mostly around bycatch avoidance. And it's almost all done by the fishing industry itself through private contractors who get daily reports data of bycatch and then have the legal authority to close areas to the contracting parties and force them to move out. And NOAA, a number of people in NOAA, both in Hawaii and the Southwest Center, have been working on various ways of predicting where bycatch will be based on oceanic conditions and the potential for closing those areas. So I'm mostly familiar with the Americans working on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if others are.
Certainly. Yunjo, do you have anything to add, or you have plenty of other questions? So.
I just want to quickly add, I don't think there's any MPAs implementing this dynamic approach, but there's definitely some research has been exploring approaches like incorporating environmental variables and also human behaviors in MP design. So that is also considering the dynamics.
Great. We have time for just a few more questions, so I am going to lump a few of them here together for you. Noah Kalsa asks, how do the benefits from MPAs to fisheries sustainability compare to just more effective management of the fishery? Would it be more advantageous to promote effective fisheries management instead of trying to implement more MPAs? And to sort of tack on another one, if you could briefly describe the spillover effect of MPAs for one of our other attendees.
Okay, well, let me answer the first question and say, yeah, I mean, we've looked at lots of fisheries where you've seen major stock rebuilding, and there's lots of examples of doing that by regulating fishing catch and effort. I am hard pressed to identify any significant fisheries that have rebuilt because of MPAs. I mean, well, no, I shouldn't say that. Well, in places where overfishing was not rampant. There are certainly some good examples of where overfishing was rampant that you did see that. So what was the second question was?
Asking about the spillover effect.
Oh, okay, the spillover effect. I mean, people have gone out of their way to try to show there's spillover. There has to be spillover, okay? If you have more fish inside a reserve, fewer outside, some of it's going to come out outside. But the only time that's going to help the benefit catch is if you're overfishing already. If you're not overfishing, then you're not going to get, I mean, the more or less the basic definition of overfishing is depleting the population enough so that the recruitment actually declines. But the example I gave in the Mediterranean, a classic case of spillover. You got spillover of large lobsters, which are unknown outside of the reserve.
Great, thank you. I think we need to move along to give Dr. Lenihan ample time for their presentation. And perhaps if there's some time at the end, we can return because there's quite a few interesting questions in the chat. But to introduce our final presenter, Dr. Hunter Langhan is a professor within the School of Applied Marine and Fisheries Ecology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Previously working for the National Marine Fisheries Service as a fisheries biologist, they have this long history of work in resource management at the intersection of specifically fisheries and ecology. They have extensively cited publications examining the effect of spatial management techniques like MPAs on California fishing communities and the ecological outcome of management measures, and are considered quite the expert in this regard. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Lenihan, please take it away.
Can you hear me pretty well?
Yes, you're coming through clearly.
And do you see the slide?
Correct, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. Maybe I'll present a little bit of information that's somewhat of an exception to what Ray was talking about, but we'll have to see. I'm a professor actually at something called the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. And today I'm really pleased to present research conducted by our U.S. National Science Foundation funded Santa Barbara Coastal Long-Term Ecological Research Program, or SBC-LTER, for which I've worked for about 20 years. The title and topic of my talk is The Ecological Consequences of Fishing in Kelp Forests, but the focus is on the influence of marine reserves on lobsters and the lobster fishery of Southern California, although I'll touch upon and discuss a bit the urchin and the fishery for the red urchin. Our general research objective is to understand how abiotic and biotic factors influence long-term fluctuations in giant kelp, an important foundational species in many coastal regions. And one theme we pursue is understanding the role of fishing on giant kelp in the kelp forest communities. To accomplish this, we examine reef-based fisheries that target kelp forest predators and macroalgal grazers. Our effort relies on long-term data sets, field surveys, even some mesocosm work, and I do lots of field experiments, and there's some modeling that's done. Our approach is unique because it includes comparisons of kelp forests that are fished with kelp forests that are located in a vast network of no fishing MPAs along the California coast. And finally, we're interested in studying how changes to the kelp forest communities and the implementation of fishing regulations, especially MPAs, feed back to influence the performance of fisheries that are so important to the Santa Barbara Channel coastal marine ecosystem. The most lucrative reef-based fishery in the Santa Barbara Channel is the trap fishery targeting the California spiny lobster, which is a top predator in kelp forests. And the second most valuable fishery is a dive fishery targeting the red sea urchin, which grazes on kelp and other species of macroalgae. The California spiny lobster, like Ray was referring to, lives gregariously on reefs and occupies caves, cracks, and crevices. And the species range and location of a very intense commercial and recreational fishery is shown on the right in red. The species range and the location of the red sea urchin fishery is shown in black. And this range overlaps with the purple sea urchin, another important grazer on reefs which is not fished. Now, despite setting and pulling like way over 1.5 million traps per year, the lobster fishery appears sustainable. And we think sustainability is due in large part to larval connectivity with large source populations of lobsters located in less heavily fished Baja, Mexico. The lobster fishery is managed with a season, a minimum size limit, and fairly recently a per vessel trap limit of 300 traps. The urchin fishery is managed also with a season and a size limit, but appears much less sustainable than the lobster fishery. I think there's compelling evidence that the lobster fishery has reduced the average size of lobsters through many decades of intense fishing. You can see that in this picture, these hardcore guys here in the 1960s with giant lobsters they caught off San Diego, with our friend Sam Shrout holding the biggest one he's caught recently. And so if you think about this, to generate the stable landings over time that I showed you, which are measured in biomass, there must be an increasing number of lobsters being caught through time. The same is suspected for the red sea urchin. Now, to determine the direct and indirect ecological effects of fishing, we focus much of our attention on trophic cascades, especially the one that involves lobster. And this primary cascade involves fishing on lobsters and its eventual effect on giant kelp. Here we observe the direct effects of fishing on lobster populations and the indirect effects on sea urchins and giant kelp. We also examine the direct and indirect of fishing on red sea urchins. Now, in an effort to minimize the ecosystem effects of fishing, the state of California established a vast network of marine reserves or no fishing MPAs. And those 86 MPAs fully protect 23% of the California coast now. The network in Southern California, as Ray showed before, is composed of 10 MPAs that were established in the Santa Barbara Channel in 2003, and another 35 or so MPAs that were established throughout the region in 2012. And we've calculated that the 45 MPAs have removed about 12% of the total lobster fishing ground in Southern California. Now I'd like to share the research questions we are addressing, our approach, and our most important results so far. I think the most fun and unique aspect of what we're doing is working with fishermen. And in doing this, we've done this through what we call collaborative fishery research, in which we work with a lobster fishery, for example, to conduct scientific trapping and to examine their fishing records. And Ray knows pretty well Matt Kay, this PhD student here, who was trained for over a year by these two fishers to go out and trap like a pro. So when he collected the data and brought it in and discussed it, they basically believed what he was telling them because they trained him to do it. And then I had another student, Sean Fitzgerald, who actually graduated from Stony Brook as an undergrad, do the same thing more recently. We also work with the fishery managers, specifically Jenny Hoffmeister, who runs invertebrate fisheries. And we do this, for example, by analyzing their long-term fishery landings. Now, using scientific trapping, we've tested the effect of fishing on lobsters by comparing populations inside and outside of the MPAs. And our prior results have shown a 6-fold increase in lobster abundance and big increases in biomass and the number of large lobsters in reserves after only 5 years. We also found that during those 5 years, the fishery around those reserves lost a lot of revenue. As Ray said, they were basically moved out of the best fishing grounds and they were distributed across space. And within a 5-year period, they hadn't redistributed and they were losing a lot of revenue because of that. That's despite the fact that we saw a big growth in the size of lobsters within the reserves compared to outside, and also compared to what the fishers were catching outside. This data shows another important fact, which is repeating that study 10 years later, at 15 years after the reserves were implemented, we saw a 20-fold increase in lobster abundance and massive increases in biomass and the number of large lobsters in the reserves after 15 years. We also found evidence of the spillover adult lobsters, not so much by tagging them and watching them walk out of reserves, but by the behavior of the fishery, because the fishery began to concentrate their effort in fishing at the edges of the border, or fishing the line, as Ray has written about in several great papers. We then tested the presence of the trophic cascade involving lobsters using Santa Barbara Coastal Reef Community Time Series data and the state's fisheries landings records. And what we found is that out of the many sites that the LTER studies, only 37% of them showed evidence of the cascade. That is, few lobsters, many urchins, and little kelp, while 63% of the sites showed no evidence of the cascade. For instance, there were many lobsters, many urchins, and much kelp. So there's not a whole lot of evidence yet of the ubiquity of the trophic cascade that was really, that helped develop the idea of establishing reserves. Using National U.S. Park Service data from the many different reserves in our region, graduate student Katrina Malakoff and her Professor Bob Miller found that despite increases in lobsters in reserves, populations of unfished purple sea urchins showed no response to protection from fishing. That is because they're not fished, while the abundance of the heavily fished red sea urchin increased substantially inside of reserves. And what these results indicate, these are the data showing that, excuse me, what these results indicate is a strong direct ecological effects of fishing on predators and kelp grazers, but also very little evidence of indirect effects on giant kelp through changes in sea urchin populations. We've gone on to use mesocosms and modeling studies in an increasing effort to examine the potential indirect effects of fishing. And so far, our findings, for instance, generated by graduate student Joey Peters, indicate that populations of very big lobsters in reserves can produce huge amounts of nitrogenous waste that may have an effect on enhancing primary productivity. Other work is going on that are looking at sort of the size structure of lobsters and how they influence urchins. And it's indicating that you need really big lobsters to eat fairly big urchins to have any effect on the capacity for urchins to be grazers. In the last few slides, I'll show you how we've addressed the question, how have marine reserves influenced the spiny lobster fishery? And at the local scale, we asked, how has the spillover of adult lobsters from MPAs influenced catch? We used LTER lobster counts done on reefs by scuba divers to address this question, as well as the state's catch data recorded by fishers by law from a grid of virtual fishing blocks that divide up space within the entire California coastal marine ecosystem. Here are 4 blocks near our campus at UCSB that we examined. Two of the marine reserves were established here in 2012 in this one fishing block, number 654, while the other 3 blocks didn't get reserves. These 2 reserves removed 35% of the fishable area in that one fishing block, but fishing continued in the remainder of the block as well as in the other 3 blocks. With our dive surveys, we found a big increase in lobster abundance in the 2 reserves after only 6 years of protection. Examining the fishery block data in a Bakke analysis, which is before-after control impact, we observed a 225% increase in lobster catch in block 654 with the MPA, as shown here in the graph. We also observed no negative effects of reserves on total catch. And this was a lot different than we found in the islands in 2012. And we're not really sure why we see that difference through time. In other words, pretty big effect, positive effect on the fishery after 6 years, while there was still a negative effect in the islands after 5 years. We found that fishers modified their fishing behavior and began to fish intensively around reserves borders. Thus, we believe that could be one of the reasons why we saw an increase in catch observed in that block. At the regional scale, we asked, how has the reserve network influenced lobster catch and revenue? We addressed this question using lobster landing data from fishing blocks distributed across the entire fishery. The data were used in another Bakke analysis in which the control blocks were those fishing blocks that never contained a reserve, and the impact blocks were those in which a reserve was established in 2012. All the blocks were fished before and after the reserves were established. And our analysis revealed across the entire fishery that fishing effort, meaning the number of traps set and pulled each season in control blocks without reserves, was much less than in reserve blocks where reserves were established. And that this was true in the before, in the black, and in the after period in gray. Thus, reserves were certainly placed in the best lobster fishing habitat. The major result here is that the reserves didn't seem to have a negative effect on lobster yield, even though reserves removed a substantial amount of good lobster fishing habitat. We then decided to divide the fishery into a north and a south region. And we did that because up in the north around Santa Barbara, it's very rich, highly productive area with massive reefs, some of them that extend out of from outside of reserve area into a fishing zone, into fishing zones, while in the south there are many more reserves, much larger fishery in general, but they're fishing often in very sparse kind of patchy reefs that are surrounded by sand. Our results indicate that the southern portion of the fishery responded much like the entire fishery did, showing no negative effect on fishery yield. By contrast, we found here in the Santa Barbara Channel in the northern portion that the effort increased substantially near reserves because of fishing the line, and that the catch went way up, very probably due to spillover. We also observed that the value of the fishery, accounting for the establishment of reserves, went way up. And we are now focusing our efforts on determining why we saw this difference in reserve effects across the region. Part of that effort includes examining time series of aerial photos of kelp abundance to determine how giant kelp has responded to Mpa implementation. So to summarize, we've observed and reported a suite of interesting ecological effects of fishing and reserve designation in kelp forests, as well as important feedbacks to the fishery caused by management actions that include the establishment of reserves. And just as a highlight, I think we found a strong direct effects of fishing on lobsters and sea urchins, but little evidence of trophic cascades that impacted giant kelp forests. We found little overall impact of reserves on yield after 6 and 15 years, in part because spillover may increase catch near reserves. That is no negative effect. These positive effects may make up for losses in revenue that we measured within 5 years of the reserves being established in 2003. And we also saw some interesting differences in the influence of reserve on yield across the entire fishery, which is now a focus of our research. And a bunch of great people worked on this, mainly grad students, as well as some investigators. And I'd point out Dan Reed, who's the leader of our LTER and is just one of the best scientists I've ever met in my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lenihan. That was terrific. Certainly seems like reductions in fishing effort, like 35%, would be a pretty difficult sell to fishing communities, but interesting that to have sort of this, with time, eventual benefit in this case anyway. We do have a question for you for Dr. Lenihan. Is there an observed reduction in lobster size between the two, or there is an observed reduction in lobster size between the two photos? What data distinguish between a long-term impact on size in the population and a reduction in age at capture due to high fishing mortality?
Good question. I'm not sure. What do you think, Ray?
Yeah, my question for you was, you know, if the abundance is increasing 20 times,
yeah,
then the fishing pressure must be enormous, right?
It's incredible.
Yeah,
it's just intense. So,
yeah, and you're probably grossly not necessarily recruitment overfishing, because you said the recruits are drifting in, but probably growth overfishing, and that's, you know, so that's probably not too different from the situation in the Mediterranean, where Raquel Goni was the lead on that. I mean, that's a staggering increase in abundance.
It's insane. You know, right out in front of my office at UCSB is a line of a reserve, and the first week that they open the fishery, we get, for every 100 meters by 300 meters zone, we get about 180 traps. They go right in there, and they fish that for almost the entire fishery. They think they remove 75 to 80% of the legal sized lobsters in much of the fishery. So it's sustainable, but it's incredibly hard fished.
Sounds like there's certainly a case to be made potentially for overcapitalization there, and perhaps by introducing the trap limit.
And just to say, the first question, I'm just not intelligent enough to answer, so that's why I avoided it.
Right. We have one additional question from Cody Sawalski. The increase in lobster catch around Lobster Point after the MPA implementation was striking. I wasn't clear, though, how effort changed after the MPAs. Did effort increase a lot as well? If so, did the CPUE change much in the area?
It was pretty interesting. The effort went way up, and the catch went up. The CPUE didn't change, but there seemed to be enough biomass to be caught in those traps, and so the overall catch went up. No change in CPU, big change in catch and effort. And so it looked like, in terms of that one situation where there was potentially spillover, that there's enough animals coming out of that reserve to withstand that, to influence the total catch, even though the effort goes up.
Great, thank you. In respect to your time, we'll just answer one or two more quick questions and then call it. So, what are the sources and sinks of spiny lobster recruitment in the Santa Barbara Channel and the Channel Islands? And how does this affect reserve design and effectiveness?
The sources are from all the different populations up and down the coast, but we think because of the most of the water movement is from south to north, that overall there's an accumulation of larvae moving from south to north. So we're in the northern portion in a high recruitment area. They spend 9 months in the water column, and so it looks like it's really high recruitment in our region. We don't know a lot about the sources. We've done some genetic work, and it looks like it's completely mixed populations throughout the whole region. But, you know, as I was going to ask Ray a question about Julio and Fio's work, showing that if you have a really intensively fished fishery and you've got places where you've got big spawners protected from fishing, it seemed to have a positive effect on the fishery. I think those guys, Julio and Fio, looked at Steve Berkeley's work with some of the rockfish fisheries or the groundfish fisheries and found that to be true. Maybe we're seeing another example of that with the lobster fisheries. In other words, it's good to protect big animals that can produce babies in a really intensively fished fishery.
I'd say it just all depends on whether you're how recruitment limited you are. Yeah, that's
and we really don't know if we're recruitment limited in the spiny lobster fishery in Southern California. Recruitment's incredibly hard to measure.
Is the size limit sort of optimal for a yield per recruit basis, or where's the?
Yes, it's about the right place for that, and also the fishery is really good at throwing back buried females. So anytime they find buried females, they're throwing them out. So they're doing a good job with that.
Great. Sounds like we're sort of benefiting from a relatively well-studied species here, where that sort of fecundity and size at age is pretty well known. For a final question, maybe, just to make sure we end close to being on time, would a reliable way to determine lobster age significantly change our understanding of this lobster MPA size dynamic?
Perhaps. I don't necessarily think so, but perhaps. I think Ray'd probably do a better answer on that. I keep shunting it to Ray just because, but he really knows fishery biology much better than I do. So I'll let him take a shot at it.
I'd be skeptical like Hunter. I mean, I think that they know enough about this species to manage it pretty well, and just knowing how old they are would just mean you'd have a. I mean, it might refine your idea of what the right size limit is.
Yeah.
Right? Because this right size limit depends upon the natural mortality rate, which usually depends upon understanding how numbers disappear with age. So it certainly would be. It couldn't hurt. Let's put it that way.
Just to link it back to climate change, if climate change comes in and starts having what we think are some pretty big negative effects on kelp, because what's going to happen, you're going to have more storms and periods of low nutrients, it's not going to do well for kelp. Under those conditions, you can have negative effects of grazing by urchins. If in fact you might have a slot limit in which you've got a few monster big lobsters around because they're not being caught, they might actually have the potential for a top-down effect on controlling urchins that might then help you in a changing climate maintain kelp. So, there's some idea that we want to maybe release the big mamas and the big daddies because of their ecological effects in the kelp forest.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to our great presenters, and thank you all to our many attendees for their interest and poignant questions. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available shortly, so please forward this to anyone you feel may find our dialogue relevant or interesting. There will be several more Crustacean Task Force webinars targeting topics such as climate change impacts on crustacean fisheries, which came up a few times today, different stock enhancement projects internationally, and applications to crustaceans, as well as presentations of some of our LenFest and EDF supported research, so stay tuned. And with that, I would like to thank you all and wish you a very good evening. And perhaps a nice Zoom round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Well, thank you much.
Goodbye.